welcome again to another edition of the KGOU Readers Club. I'm KGOU Managing Editor Logan Layden. Today we highlight the book Redface, Race, Performance, and Indigeneity. And it's by Bethany Hughes and from NYU Press, just out recently. And I'm fortunate enough to have the author, Bethany Hughes, with me today. Bethany, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, indeed. We're going to get right into the conversation here. I think for me, Redface was a real learning opportunity. A lot of research obviously went into the book here, and I just want to, before we get into the subject matter, I want to try to learn a little bit about you for our listeners here. So, Bethany Hughes, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and what sort of led you to want to write this book.
Yeah. So there's the sort of professional story and the personal story. I'll give you the professional, official one. So I have loved theater and performance my whole life. I've participated in community theater as a kid and high school. Um, I went Oklahoma Summer Arts Institute. I grew up in Oklahoma, so I did that. Was a major in theater. Ended up getting a bachelor's in theater and musical theater, a master's from the University of Oklahoma in drama, and I have a PhD from Northwestern University in theater and drama. So like I just have loved theater forever. And um, grew to really wonder how Native Americans are represented in American theater, and then also how Native Americans are using theater. Like, what is Native American theater? And what are the ways that Indigenous peoples participate in performance? And that comes sort of the connection of personal and professional. So I was born in Tulsa. We moved around a bit as a kid, so I've lived in several different states, but spent about half my childhood near my dad's family in southeastern Oklahoma. My family's from the Bennington area, so I lived in Durant and ended up in Oklahoma City. My parents moved there when I was in high school, so when I come home, I visit them in Oklahoma City. Um, I'm also a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. So that sort of curiosity came from like, how do these two parts of the way that I experience the world, one through theater and performance, and the other as a Native American, how do they come together? And so this book is sort of the result of me thinking about how those two parts of my life join together and how they can help explain one another, basically.
Well, we have at least somewhat similar backgrounds, at least geographically. I'm from McAllister myself, born and raised down there. And every time I go back to my hometown, the way I get there is by going down I-40 and then taking the Indian Nation Turnpike down to
Mhm.
McAllister. Indian, that's the word that you start your book here with, a red face, and you describe it as a blunt weapon. So we'll start right at the very beginning with the very first word of the entire book here. But the way the book is laid out, there's a lot of research involved in this, but there's also some personal stories woven into it. You kind of take the reader along with you on that research journey. And the way that it's laid out is interesting. You know, I remember when I was a kid, we would have those books where, you know, if you want to take this road, turn to page 46. If you want to go this direction, turn to page
Yep. The choose your
23.
own adventure.
Yes. And there is a little bit of an aspect of that to Redface here, the sort of the adult version of that.
Yes.
I read it
Yes.
straight through, but it's interesting because there's an essay, and I'll let you talk about this, that's sort of interspliced, sprinkled in throughout the course of the book, that as the reader, you're sort of rolling along, you're into it. There's this sort of shift complete, and all of a sudden you're confronted with something different over the course of the book. But that wasn't by accident. You did that with a design in mind. Can you explain a little bit about why you laid the book out the way you did here?
Yes. So for people who haven't seen the book, um, It is structured like you might expect a work of sort of academic nonfiction, right? There's an introductory chapter. There's four chapters, number one, two, three, four, that look at historical representations of Native Americans in American theater, 19th century into the late 20th century. Then at the end of the book, there's a sort of a shorter piece, kind of like a conclusion that actually prompts you to do a little more reading. And what you're describing is that little more reading. So there's an essay that's called Hinoshi'ina, which is Choctaw for like another path or a different path, or that kind of thing. Shout out to my Choctaw teacher, Miss Teresa, for translating and helping me name that. Um, so that essay is lives alongside the book. The book is it lives alongside and inside of. The book is trying to explain how American theater represents Native Americans and how over time these practices, the stories that are told, the costumes that are used, the makeup, all of these things, and how this idea of a racial identity of a Native American or an Indian, and I don't shy away from that word Indian. It's a really useful word and it's a really meaningful word. In some places, people are a little nervous about using it, and then other places they're not at all, right? So the book is about how does the stage Indian exist, and what are the stakes of it existing in the world for Native Americans and for non-Native Americans. This essay, Hinoshi'ima, is about something different. It's about how have Native Americans used theater and performance? What do they make? What do they create? What are they interested in? What kind of questions are they trying to answer? um, that is happening alongside of what I show in the book is American theater, constructing this kind of like very generic, kind of stereotypical, you can call it racist depiction of Native Americans, right? This thing that's like less than like fully human, less than as interesting and as complex as actual Native American life is. And alongside of that, there were always Native Americans who were using theater and performance in interesting ways, right? Sometimes artistic, sometimes for political purposes, sometimes for educational purposes. And so that essay, I call it like it's sort of sprinkled throughout the book, right? It's interspersed. Like there'll be a couple pages here, and then you have to go to a different spot to read the next few pages, and then you have to go to a different spot to read the next few pages. And on these pages are directions, right? Like you're talking about, like to the next spot, go to page 76, right? Like there's instructions on there. So it's not quite choose your own adventure as far as where you go next, but it is about choice. Um, because part of the project of this book is trying to explain to American theater audiences, and sort of theater historians, that the creation of the stage Indian took a lot of time and a lot of people agreeing together to do it, right? It takes an actor and an audience member to identify a particular character. And so Redface, the book's project, is try to say that Redface isn't just the costume that an actor puts on. It's also the audience looking at an actor and saying, oh, I know that character is the character we call the Indian. And now the Indian that travels with this sort of generic, homogenous identity. Um, and so if the audience is implicated, if they're also responsible for the creation of Redface, then they're also empowered to make something better, right? It's not just wait until the actors have a better costume. It's how do I, as an audience member, train myself to look for a better, more nuanced, more complete, more interesting, more true to life experience for Native American characters, right? And so I wanted readers to have to work at it because it is work.
Hmm.
The stage Indian is the easy Indian to see. Um, and so, what would it mean for people to have to realize I'm actually going to have to choose as an audience member what I consume, what plays I go to, what movies I watch, and I'm going to have to watch for and try to learn about something. And so that's why Hunoshi Ima exists, sprinkled and interspersed throughout the book, because it gives you a little taste of like, it'll be a little discomforting, but also interesting and kind of fun, like a choose your own adventure book.
The book is Redface, Race, Performance, and Indigeneity. That's from NYU Press, just out within the last few months. The author of Redface is Bethany Hughes. I'm KGOU Managing Editor Logan Layden. Much more to discuss here on the KGOU Readers Club. That'll be coming up after a short break for us. This is KGOU, your NPR source. We're back again for more of the KGOU Readers Club. I'm KGOU Managing Editor Logan Layden, continuing our discussion of the book Redface, Race, Performance, and Indigeneity, with author Bethany Hughes, who is with me for the hour. And so, for people listening out there, if you shut your eyes and you think of the word Indian, what comes to mind? And what comes to mind for probably a lot of people are, feathers, headdresses, beads. The fact that that's what comes to mind when you think Indian is something that has evolved over years, over decades, over centuries. So I guess take us back to how that sort of stereotype was formed. I mean, in your book, you go all the way back to like the 1600s and the very sort of beginnings of the depictions of Native Americans in theater specifically.
Mhm.
So take us through that a little bit about how that formed over time, what we
Yeah.
think of as an Indian.
Yeah, so there are a lot of pieces over, like you said, a very long time period, right? That make this image that's so quick to come to our minds in 21st century America, right? So in the book, I mentioned some performances from the 1600s, right? Like what's happening in European theater when they're telling stories about the New World, and the way that Virginian princes is what they're called, right? These are like tribal chiefs from Virginia area, right? And the way that they're depicted in like Great Britain in the 1600s is very different from what comes to your or my mind when we say Indian, right? The one thing that stays the same, that's pretty solid across these time, is feathers, which are both accurate in a way and then also become stereotypical, right? They become kind of detached from actual ways that they use, right? So things like skin, right? Like the absence of clothing become a way that that Native Americans are depicted in European theater. Although they typically cover it with like sort of like body stockings, right? Not actually skin, right? It would be like wildly inappropriate in the time period to have like actual skin. Um, Over time that shifts, and so you get a lot of like just loincloth wearing actors in the 20th century, in America. But so we have these sort of markers, these visual markers, right? There's feathers, there's oftentimes weapons, right? So like very early images of Native Americans, or images that stand in for America as a place, but are like the Indian princess or the Indian queen will also have like a club or a bow and arrow or a hatchet, right? Something that represents sort of physical violence or the ability to inflict violence, while there's also wearing some sort of feather, maybe in some sort of crown-like configuration to show, right, a chief or a princess or some sort of nobility. Skin tone is another one that gets shown regularly across theater, right, which is typically used as makeup, which is why red face is the name of the book, right? This is like, what makeup do actors put on to demonstrate to an audience that they're an Indian, and the color is red. So we have these sort of skin makeup things. We have costuming choices like feathers, eventually beads. We have the absence of clothing. Um, Hair becomes really important across the 19th century, right? So by the 19th century, American theater is starting to get a little more standardized. And then you get like costume lists in plays that are published that say Indian shirt, right? The man is in an Indian shirt. And like, from a 21st century perspective, you're like, what makes an Indian shirt, right? Is like my dad wearing a t-shirt and Indian shirt, or is there something else, right? And so clearly it's something else. But so we have these shapes of clothing, like silhouettes of fashion, along with beads, jewelry, ornamentation comes up a lot across the 19th century. Um, and then by the end of the 19th century, around the turn of the 20th century, it starts being a lot more codified or solidified into like kind of one image. And this is connected most often to Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and other Wild West shows, of which there were many, of which like Miller Brothers 101 Ranch, that was like headquartered in Oklahoma, was one of these Wild West shows, right? And the popularity of these shows, the number of these shows, the longevity of these shows, we're talking decades, millions of people see them across the US, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, like these things go global. And Buffalo Bill's Wild West was like the first, the most famous, the most popular, the best, um, and exclusively hired Oglala Lakota, like Sioux Indians. And so the very culturally specific markers like clothing and regalia that American audiences are seeing are actually really narrowly connected to Oglala Lakota. Except then American audiences are like, we want to go see a show that has Indians in it, but they have to look like the Indians we expect, which then meant that everybody else had to look and dress like Oglala Lakota. For instance, I was at the Western History Collection at OU doing research for this book, and I found some correspondence between the Miller Brothers 101 Ranch show and some native performers who were like, I think like out near Anadarko or something. And they are not Sioux and were like looking for work for, the season. Basically, like, I can come be an Indian in your show. And the Miller brothers wrote them back and were like, yeah, we could hire you. Here's what we could pay you. Make sure you either have long hair or have a really good wig, and they had this list of expectations of what they were going to look like. And those were Sioux, right? So you get these like Cheyenne and Arapaho guys from Oklahoma trying to get a job, but they have to look Sioux in order to get a job to play an Indian because that's what the figure comes to mind. And really, ever since that Wild West show moment, American audiences and global audiences have really narrowed in on those really specific visual markers that come to mind so easily, right? The feathered headdress, the horse, the kind of regalia and the beads. And um, so that gets connected from the Wild West show, gets picked up, and then it goes into film, it goes into television. And so then it gets even more global circulation. And so now, you can show the feathered headdress and market as an Indian internationally. So I like to tell my students the last film that won an Oscar for best film that had somebody wear a feathered headdress and attack, right, like an Indian, was 2019, the Korean film Parasite. There's a character who puts on a feathered headdress and some face paint and proceeds to attack. Has nothing to do with Native Americans. The plot isn't about Native Americans. It's a Korean film set in Korea about Korea class tension, and yet the Indian shows up there, right? And we can point that Indian, connect it directly back to Wild West shows, which had these precursors before them of feathers and face paint and costuming, centuries before. But the one that's most commonly recognized is really situated in that like turn of the 20th century moment.
Well, I want to ask you about just that sort of generalization and why that is so destructive for Native Americans. I mean, when we're talking about blackface, uh, that's obvious. I mean, it is gross. It is right in your face. This caricature, this stereotype of black people. There's more nuance when you're talking about Redface. It does a disservice to Native Americans similarly as blackface does for black people, but it's also a little bit different. If you could talk about a little bit of the sort of differences and similarities when we're talking about blackface versus redface, as it pertains to theater?
Yeah, that's a great question. And really one of the starting points of my whole like research project was there was so much cultural awareness around what blackface is, why it's damaging, and sort of a kind of general kind of cultural embarrassment that it one existed and two existed for so long because we understand clearly about what the damage is, right? And red face, that sort of cultural understanding just isn't the same, right? It's just not viewed the same. Um, I'll give you a couple examples from like the last month. One was at one of the pre-inauguration balls. The village people came and performed their super famous song YMCA, right? Like everybody loves YMCA, everybody can do the dance. Um, and so like they're on this stage as part of the transition, the peaceful transition of power in the United States. There's a guy with a feathered headdress and like a fake leather vest on, playing the Indian, the Native American YMCA dancing, right? Like the village people are there, right? And this is, the leader of the free world is like 6 feet away from a guy dressed up like a stereotypical Indian, right? Like this is in the last month. Um, a couple weeks ago, you might have been watching football and you might have seen the Chiefs play. And you might have, if you're watching on TV, like I watched on TV because I'm very far away from all of these things, living in Michigan, you might have seen the audience doing the tomahawk chop and singing the song, right? Like the little chant, right? So these are both examples of things that I would lump in with red face, right? What it means to perform certain things that everybody knows means Indian, right? One is costumes, like we have the YMCA. We know that's the Native American village people person. And the other is doesn't have a costume, but it has choreography and it has a song, right? And we all know who does the tomahawk chop. That's an Indian thing, right? It's a chief thing. So, so these are ways that like we still have red face in ways that we don't necessarily have blackface in the same kinds of ways, right? So that's a distinction about sort of the ease with which American culture still represents Native Americans and still relies on this very simplistic understanding of Native Americans in these representational moments. Another distinction between blackface and redface is really about what racial and political work they're doing. Um, and that's sort of what do they accomplish? Like what is accomplished when you have red face? So in the book, I'm arguing that red face is not just a costume that somebody can put on, but red face is a process. It's a process that artists and audiences together work, right, to curate how what do we need to see in order for an audience to know they're seeing an Indian? What does the artist need to do in order for the audience to be able to understand, right? Like what's this space, this communication between artist and audience, right? So if red face is like a process or a mechanism, if it's not just a costume, then what are we actually creating in that process? And I spend most of the book trying to explain that what's happening when you make a stage Indian is you're working artist and audience together to create this category called the Indian, right? It's a racial category, um, and it is an essentialist category, and it's one that's highly visible and easily identified, right? Like if you see someone with a feathered headdress on, they are an Indian on stage. Easy, now we're done. We've figured it out. Now, what that doesn't do, and this is where the damage of red face is what that undoes, right? In the making of this like one generic Indian kind of idea, is it does a disservice and it dismantles the actual complexity and diversity and just variety within Native American nations and cultures, right? There's about 574 federally recognized Native American nations right now. Um, and they are not all the same. Right? in almost every possible way you can be different, they are different, right? Of the spectrum of nations, right? And so if you assume that all members of all 574 are exactly the same, then you're not actually paying attention to the specific experiences or needs. You're also not paying attention to the fact that they're nations, right? And the way that we understand race in America is not necessarily connected to a national, like a kind of citizenship identity, right? And so this is one of the things I do in my classes when I teach undergrads, is to talk about the difference between race and nation, or race and citizenship, right? Like, I am a citizen, an enrolled member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. I have political rights and political responsibilities to that nation because of belonging to it. Just like I am a citizen of the United States of America and I have political rights and political responsibilities for that, right? And neither one of those are that invested in a racial identity. Um, and so the stage Indian and Redface is really pushing this idea of like, Indian is a race. Indian is a race. There's only one thing of Indian. And if you're part of that one category, then we totally understand what's happening and we know how to deal with you. What it's stopping is, Indian is not really a race. Indian is a category that covers over the complexity of hundreds of nations that have governments and um, judges and laws and human services and healthcare and, right, all the things that nations have, right? And so that is what I'm trying to explain to people, that the real damage of red face is not just that, like, not everybody wears a feathered headdress and it's inaccurate, but that by saying that there's one category, this racial category called the Indian, you are refusing to engage with the actual facts, which is there are hundreds of Native nations that you have to work with and understand on a political level, on a level of sovereignty, of tribal sovereignty. That race just allows you to, like, skip over those often really difficult, but also really interesting and um, really full and human and complex and messy and complicated and fun and vibrant, right? Like, all of that that's actually happening, Redface sort of just covers over.
And that's even when it's done with what appear to be good intentions. That's one of the enlightening things that came across to me while reading the book, was even when there are attempts made to represent Native Americans as sympathetic characters, as perhaps even heroes in a story, it's that generalization, that red face is still there, even when when it appears that it's trying to be done with good intentions.
Right, right. When the stories that are being told are supporting the idea that there's a single category of the racialized Indian, we're still doing red face. Even, right, even if the character is sympathetic or they're funny or they get the last laugh, or, right, all of those other things, which are positive in sort of portraying the human aspect of Native American experience. But if they're in service to the Indian, then it's still doing red face. And this is the case that I'm trying to make in this book, right? That relying either on just the costume or even on the identity of the actor themselves is actually not where we should be looking to try to answer this question about what red face is. And therefore, if that's where you're trying to solve the problem of red face, you're not going to solve it if all you're doing is trying to get a better costume, or if you're trying to hire the right actor. So, for example, in the book, I talk about the musical Annie Get Your Gun, which is a very widely known musical, very popular for, like, basically 75 years. And there was a revival on Broadway in 1999 that really, with incredibly good intentions, wanted to kind of clean up the very generic, very stereotypical kind of racist language and depictions that had happened around Native Americans for this show, right? Clearly identified that this was a problem, that they didn't want to participate in this, right? They didn't want to. But the solutions they implemented actually still relied on the logic of single racial category, right? So they created a character who was a mixed race, right? Like had native ancestry and white ancestry. And instead of talking about the specific character, connecting it to a specific nation, a people, a region, anything, they just labeled Indian and then kept saying half Indian, right? And so this goes to that what we call, like racializing logic of blood quantum in America, right? The idea that racial intermixture results in the erasure or the diminishment of Indianness, right? And this shows up in blood quantum, and which is uh, outside of Oklahoma and outside of Native communities. I have learned that far fewer people are familiar with the concept of blood quantum. That growing up in Oklahoma, it was just kind of a thing I felt like people knew. Um, but so, this idea that, like my mom is white and my dad is Choctaw. And so I am understood like by the federal government as less Choctaw than my dad. We don't understand Blackness to work in the same way. Legally, in parts of America, the idea of the one drop rule existed, right? If your great, 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 great grandmother was likely an enslaved African, then you are Black, right? And we have these laws about that perpetuated the idea that Blackness like sticks around and it keeps sticking, and it doesn't matter how much racial intermixture, it's always there, right? Which is like I talk about these in class, like the exact opposite of Indianness, right? Blackness in America is the thing that always sticks around, and Indianness is the thing that you can never hold on to. So if you think that those are both intuitive ways of understanding racial identity, then you know that one of them is wrong, right? They can't both be the way that race works because they're opposite. They're working the opposite, right? And so this is what I mean when I say this invention of a mixed race character in 1999 on Broadway that keeps talking about him as half Indian is actually subscribing to this logic of blood quantum, the idea that Indianness disappeared, that it's a racial identity, that intermixture with other races makes it go away over time, right? That is still carried forward in this show that worked really hard not to do anything racist, right? They didn't do red faced and they didn't have the like makeup and they didn't have the jokes that were about Indians, where the butt of the joke is the Indian, but they actually held on to this racial logic that actually perpetuates the Indian on stage and off stage.
Well, it makes it very difficult, and we'll discuss here in a bit of uh, how to fix this, how to potentially do it the right way, represent Native Americans the proper way. Again, the book is Redface, Race, Performance, and Indigeneity. That's from NYU Press, which just came out in the last few months. The author of Redface is Bethany Hughes. I'm KGOU Managing Editor Logan Layden. We do have more to discuss here on the KGOU Readers Club. That'll be after a short break from us here on KGOU, your NPR source. We're back for the final segment of today's edition of the KGOU Readers Club. I'm KGOU Managing Editor Logan Layden as we continue our discussion of Redface, Race, Performance, and Indigeneity with the author Bethany Hughes. And for Native Americans, I mean, it almost seems like to sort of get credit as an important Native American in the history of the United States, you have to be associated with this sort of stage Indian, this sort of stereotype. I think about you talk about Will Rogers in the book some, and I went to Will Rogers Elementary in McAllister. I knew about Will Rogers. He's one of the most famous Oklahomans ever, humorist, cowboy, Cherokee. Wasn't really taught that in elementary school. And he himself didn't shy away from it. He's quite proud of his Native American heritage, but didn't didn't really fit the bill of what we think of when we think of an Indian, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, exactly. So I love talking about Will Rogers. Again, like outside of Oklahoma, he is not nearly as well known. I mean, like I also grew up knowing who Will Rogers was because I know I lived in Oklahoma. My grandmother had like a not a painting, it was I can't remember. It's like a relief or something. Like not quite a sculpture, but like it hung on the wall of like Will Rogers, right? Like it was like a bust of Will Rogers. I'm just like up in my grandmother's house my whole life, right?
Mhm.
Um, so he's sort of like a household name. Outside of Oklahoma, not as much. So his career is fascinating because he starts out in Wild West shows. He gets hired to like do rope tricks because he's amazing at rope tricks, right? And so he's a cowboy and he does rope tricks and he ropes he ends up having like a vaudeville act where he ropes horses and people and things like that. Um and when he starts his vaudeville career, he's billed as the Cherokee Kid, right? And like all of this press coverage is about him as an Indian, and they make up some stuff that's totally not true about him and like kind of sensationalize the Indian part, but he's like very clearly publicly advertised as an Indian. Once Oklahoma statehood hits in 1907, that billing starts going away really interestingly, and he gets shifted to being advertised as a cowboy. And then it's pretty much cowboy from then on out, right? He's the poet laureate of America. He becomes known for his sort of humorous, folksy cultural commentary. And then he's incredibly successful, right? He's just like everywhere. He's on radio. He's doing like national speaking tours. He has syndicated like columns in newspapers daily and weekly. He's publishing essays. He's a movie star. He's like out earning Mae West and Shirley Temple in the early 1930s, right? Like he's just super famous. At the time of his death, which was, as you probably know, in a really tragic plane accident, the coroner like report lists his race as white, right? Like his Cherokee-ness, which like he proudly proclaimed through his whole career. Like it shows up all the time, and he's talks about being Cherokee, going home, seeing his Cherokee people, right? Like it's there. It's not like every time he opens his mouth he says it, but he consistently communicates this, and it's just like American audiences can't even hear, right? Like he's telling them I'm Cherokee, and nobody can accept that. And this is one of those other factors of like what damage does Redface do? Because everybody was expecting the Wild West show Indian with the feathered headdress, riding a horse, probably battling the cavalry and then dying, right? Like the vanishing Indian. Um, and instead, they got this guy with a rope and a cowboy hat, chewing gum, making jokes about like, popular current events. It was like nobody could see what was right in front of their faces, right? And so this is the thing that Redface does. So it makes the audience unable to fully understand the world that they're in, because when we say, wow, we wish we had, more Native American representation in American media, wouldn't it be better if we had better, more complex stories about Native American life or movies? Well, we had like all of that in like 1930 when Will Rogers was around, right? I mean, like it already existed. It's just the American public didn't know because he wasn't the Indian they were looking for.
That's, yeah, absolutely fascinating. I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion that, how much research must have gone into putting this book together, and you kind of do you have some personal sort of anecdotes at the beginning of the chapters about your encounters with Redface in modern times as you were getting prepared for this book. You briefly sort of touched on your experience in Boston, going to this, people can't see me doing the air quotes, museum about the Boston Tea Party. I want to ask you about a couple of those. And you were disturbed by this. What was it that disturbed you about that
So
particular trip?
Yeah, so I was at an academic conference for people who study and teach theater in universities, and there was some extra conference excursions, is what they were called. One of them was a tour at the Boston Tea Party Museum, which is actually a tourist attraction that's like a for-profit venture. So it's not a museum in the way that you might think it's a museum. It is historical, but the goal is for tourists to like have fun thinking about the Tea Party. So the person who organized that excursion had told me, because they knew that I am Native and also know that I study representation of Native Americans, they sort of warned me in advance, like, just so you know, like there'll be this opportunity for people to like dress up like an Indian and throw tea overboard, right? Um, and so I was like, actually, I would love to see that as somebody who studies Redface, please. Like, I actually want to see this happen. Um, and so when our tour group was called in to start the tour, um, there was a young man who was holding open the doors for us, holding this satchel of feathers. So he's, dressed in, like 1780s garb or 1770s garb. And he like holds out this like satchel of feathers and says like, in case you need to disguise yourself later. And everybody's just like casually picking up this like brown feather and carrying it into the space where we're going to have our first historical reenactor come talk to us, kind of thing. um and I reacted much more strongly than I thought I would to that moment. um in part because I thought it would be a feathered headdress that people could put on right before they threw the tea overboard, right? And instead, it was this really casual, um, kind of nonchalant thing, like, here, have a feather. and and then in the first room where they were the reenactors are talking to us, they explained what the feather was for, right? Like, this is for to disguise yourself as we go in the night to protest these injustices that the British crown are causing. And they also explained that it was because we were specifically going to be dressing up as Mohawk, disguising ourselves as Mohawk, and that was particularly because of like the the sort of bravery and strength of the Mohawk, right? It was very clearly framed as something that like honors the Mohawk and recognizes like they're excellent at something, and so we want to emulate that, and so we're going to put this feather on. Um, and and I was really almost shocked about it because it was so easy. And because I looked around and there's a room full of total strangers holding on to a feather, or some of them just stuck it in the back of their ball cap they were wearing, or other people, like um, everybody knew what to do with it, where they were supposed to wear it when they got it. Most people did not wear it. Most people that in my tour group didn't. The people I knew and the people I didn't know. Some people did, but I was just really shocked at one, everybody knew what to do with it. And two, everybody knew that one feather was going to disguise you as something totally different and clearly Indian. And yeah, and then on the other side of it, after the whole reenactment thing, we went through all the rooms and saw, and it's very interesting and it's fun. They do a good job. So if you like the Boston Tea Party, it's not bad to go. Um, but at the end of the tour, you know how people are when you hand them something, they like drop it or they throw it away or they leave it in these places. And so then I just started noticing feathers on the ground and feathers that were just kind of litter. And then there's, of course, a gift shop that you go through on the way out. And people had just tucked the feathers into random places in the gift shop because they didn't want to carry it and they didn't want to keep it. And so then there was this like, the detritus of Indianness is happening. Like, what does it mean for this one little feather to stand in for so much information and so symbolic? and be so easy to throw away or forget about, and of such little value, right? And I think all of that together was really something I spent a lot of time thinking about. Like, what does it mean for everybody to agree what an Indian is so quickly and so easily, and then um, forget it so quickly and so easily?
Well, and you also had an interesting interaction with Pocahontas character at Disney, but I'll let the readers get to that because before we come to the end of our time here, I do want to talk about the future a little bit, the present day, and just how I want to end on a bit of a hopeful note, I suppose. You know, Redface has been destructive throughout the course of history, but it does seem that perhaps some progress is being made. Perhaps you've seen some things here in the 21st century that are maybe doing a better job of trying to address this and to represent Native Americans better, more accurately in media. So let's end on a hopeful note, if we can here, fixing Redface, which is the final chapter
Yeah.
of the book.
Yeah. I mean, like if you want to not watch Redface, there are options now, right? That there had not been as readily available options, right? And some of those are theatrical. There's a really funny play called The Thanksgiving Play by a Chicago Lakota playwright named Larissa Fasthorse. It's been widely produced across the country. It was on Broadway in 2023. It's a satire of sort of white liberal guilt and attempts at allyship. It's these four characters trying to write a Thanksgiving play for elementary students, but they don't have any Native Americans, and they want to do a really good job and be really honest and respectful of Native Americans, but they don't have any Native Americans. And so it like presents all of these problems of like, how do we tell this story about Native Americans without them, and what's our responsibility? And it gets just kind of silly and very over the top, and it's a satire, and it's hilarious. Um, and people all over the country are producing this because it's fun and it's funny, and it's smart. And right, so like go see the Thanksgiving play. Like there's an easy one. It's happening all over. Um, for film and television, there's a whole lot more options than there were even 10 years ago, right? Reservation Dogs is the one that gets like all the attention, filmed in Oklahoma. Um, but there's other, like think it's called Spirit Rangers. Oh, I'm going to say the wrong name. Maybe we'd have to like correct that. Um, there's a children's show that has Native American writers. That's a cartoon, but told with sensitivity and with accuracy, like fun kid entertainment, right? Like, and it's just a cartoon that is shaped by Native American experience. Right? Like there's a kid thing. Reservation Dogs is maybe for older kids and grown-ups. There are films that are coming out and filmmakers. I mean, Sterling Harjo is the big one that gets a lot of attention, and is doing a lot of really good work. There are theater companies like Native Voices at the Autry, which is in housed at the Autry Museum of the American West in Los Angeles. And they're a 30-something-year-old company that just produces and supports the development of Native American playwrights, First Nations, Native Hawaiian, Alaska Native. And so they do a short play festival every year, and they do a full length play festival every year. And there's a Yale Indigenous Performing Arts program, I think it's called YPAP, which does workshops for young Native writers and performances, and they have like an annual prize, right? There are places that are investing in and developing Native talent to tell stories that are interesting and fun and funny and heartwarming and accurate. And some of those are trying to engage with Redface and think about the ways that these like histories of representation have been harmful. And some of them are like not even doing that. They're doing something else that's like in their own direction, which I actually really love to see, right? Like, what would it mean to just like let Native artists loose and let them make whatever art they make, right? Like they don't necessarily have to be responding to some history that's harmful or painful, that they can just be creative. And I think there's increasingly more, like, there's a lot more like musicians and artists that are easy to get to. Like, if you go to Spotify, there are whole like Spotify playlists of contemporary indigenous musicians from all over the continent in every genre of music you can imagine. There are native artists there, right? From classical to like heavy metal, there's like native artists making these things. So I think it is a hopeful moment because one, technology has made it so easy for people to get to the artists, right? And for artists to get their work out there, right? With Spotify lists, with YouTube, with social media, all of a sudden we have access to all of these creatives across the country and across the continent that are doing really fun and interesting work. It tends to take a little bit of digging to get there, but not too much digging. And then you get to like discover, I don't know, like your favorite native hip hop and rapper. Like, go. There's like a whole world out there.
Well, yes, indeed. Well, I'm so lucky that I get to, read these books and then get to actually talk to the author and pepper him with a bunch of questions about it. And I really learned a lot from this one and also learned that there's more learning to do. So, author Bethany Hughes of Redface, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. And that will do it for this edition of the KGOU Readers Club. Once again, thank you to Bethany Hughes, author of Redface, Race, Performance, and Indigeneity from NYU Press. And thank you, listeners, for joining us. I'm KGOU Managing Editor Logan Layden, and this is KGOU, your NPR source.